Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. I'm the producer, Caleb Keith, and I'm joined by our hosts, Doctors Rod Rosenblatt, Scott Keith, and Adam Francisco. Follow these great minds as they answer pressing questions about theology, history, and apologetics. This show is brought to you by 1517 The Legacy Project, serving to proclaim the gospel to all people, especially those broken by the church. Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. Today we're getting back on track, I would say.
Back to the normal crew.
Yeah, that's right. We've done a lot of guest episodes, and that's great. It's a lot of fun. I think kind of hopping out of our original Lochi topics allowed us to kind of branch out into some areas of particular expertise per people.
We also hit a milestone today.
Yes.
Did we not?
As of recording today, so this is August 28th, 2016, we have broken 10,000 downloads for the month. So that's a record for us. Last month we had 8,500 downloads, so we are back on the growth train. Choo-choo.
We were at 10,200 as of this morning before church, right?
Yeah,
Wow.
10,200. I think at this rate, because downloads have been fantastic, thank you listeners, we have not dipped below 200 downloads since July 24th.
200 a day.
Yeah, 200 a day.
Yeah.
So every day since July 24th, we've had at least 200 people download the show, which is just fantastic. So within the next 3 days of the month here, we might be able to grab 11,000 downloads this month, which would just be fantastic. So today we're going to hop into apologetics. On the last episode, talking about apologetics, we kind of did an introduction into what is apologetics? Why would we even do this? Why is this a transition for us from the theological topics we did before? And today we're going to kind of jump right in to the meat of the matter. So, Dr. Keith, you want to kind of introduce what we're going to start with today?
Sure. Again, I think it'd be helpful for us to do a couple things right out of the gate. Perhaps we'll go around and maybe have Adam or Rod just define apologetics again. We also today wanted to accomplish maybe going through some of an introduction, or maybe even better to say description of the various methods that have been used, apologetic methods used throughout history. And if we have some time left, I've got a couple other things I'd like to get done. If not, we'll save it for another episode. Just as a reminder to the listeners, this is the Thinking Fellows podcast. We are in my garage around my old dining room table recording. We do enjoy an adult beverage from time to time, so you might hear that, and I like to enjoy my pipe on these days and my Frog Morton Cellar tobacco. And I think Adam might have something today. So you might hear a lighter clicking in the background. You might hear Adam jonesing on his Rockstar.
That's just so against the ethos.
Cucumber lime flavor.
Cucumber lime.
Oh, that is so gross.
Rockstar. Okay, so let's get into it. So Adam, maybe, why don't you tell us just for the listeners one more time, what is apologetics?
Well, in short, it's the defense of the Christian faith. The biblical proof text, if you will, is 1 Peter 3:15, which exhorts all Christians to always be prepared to give a response or make a defense for the hope that is in you, doing this with gentleness and respect. And the Greek word behind make a defense is apologia, or that's the Greek root, which is, in many ways, has kind of a legal connotation. In Greek literature, probably the earliest instance the word is used is in the writings of Plato, where he describes Socrates, or Bill and Ted's Socrates.
Now I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, where he's been, Socrates has been accused of causing the youth of Athens to run wild, to question the gods. And
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure needs to go in the show notes now. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I can do that. It is available on Hulu, listeners, if you need to watch it.
Goodness.
I didn't know that was that funny. I never get laughs out of you guys.
Well, you got one. You got one today. Just relish it and just.
Anyway, so Plato writes this work describing Socrates' defense of himself over and against the charges that have been made. He calls it Socrates' Apology, or the Apology of Socrates, and it's a formal defense of of Socrates and everything he's taught to, in a sense, speak off the charges that have been made against him. So that's 5th century BC. Maybe the term was used before then, but that's the first time it pops up, as far as I know, in Greek literature. But St. Paul uses it. Luke uses it in the book in Acts when he describes many of Paul's sermons. Like I think, in particular, of Paul before King Agrippa in Acts 26.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's it in short. There's obviously a lot more to it.
Right. And there's obviously not one approach to doing this. At Concordia, when I was with Dr. Rosenblatt, and you were too, and then out in Strasbourg with Dr. Montgomery, we went over many of the different methods, but we focused primarily on one of them. So I thought it might be helpful today just to kind of do a sort of 30,000-foot view of the different methods before we spend several weeks diving into them.
Sure.
So the one that we learned the most at Concordia, and then also with Dr. Montgomery, Rod, is the evidential apologetic. Mm-hmm. Can you give us sort of a background on that? What is the evidential method?
Well, it's the bringing to bear of objective evidence to try and defend a thesis. In other words, it's fact-based, which, parenthetically, opens the door to every scientist in a way that no other method does.
Why is that?
Because he's so used to living in the lab. He's not working with deducing anything. He's only one step above an IBM chess-playing machine, Baconian induction, every possible move before you move. The advantage of evidentialism is that if it's done right, it's based on evidence that's public, objective and public, which means anybody can evaluate.
So the evidential apologetic essentially focuses on the claims of Christ in the New Testament and then evaluating whether those claims can be in some way measured or verified externally or objectively.
But just think what you're saying there. You're starting in the middle of the whole biblical story, and you're correct. You can have evidentialists in the science history debate that are doing Hebrew vowel points in Genesis. And technically that would be evidential. But then you've got the problem of the Old Testament manuscripts and the distance between writer and best text that we now have and so forth. All sorts of things that are difficult to do directly. But if you start in the middle of the story with the incarnate Christ, then if you have questions about the extant Greek New Testament, that's solvable. That is absolutely solvable. Questions of authenticity, authorship, canon even, those can be solved. Not to a mathematical 100% certainty degree, but to a high, such that they would pass in any court of law.
Sure.
So you can have evidentialism that's not directed to anything about Christ, and it'll go forever. For every 10 questions you answer, there'll be 15 more next. And it's not very efficient. But if the old Lutherans were right, that the clearest revelation of God was when he became a human being, and you start there, then maybe this is a doable task.
Gotcha.
So is it safe to say that the evidential apologetic is the best to address the concerns of scientific naturalists?
Oh, yes, absolutely, and probably the only one. There aren't many competitors to that. That doesn't mean they'll become believers, but at least you're operating in the common territory you're both in, this world.
Yeah, at Concordia, I teach so does Adam, actually, in the core program, and it's basically, I always struggle to give it just a succinct explanation, but it's basically liberal arts, general education classes done from a great books perspective.
Yep.
Is that a good way to say it? Or primary source perspective. Mm-hmm. In other words, when we study Aquinas or about Aquinas, we're actually reading Aquinas to get that job done, rather than reading sort of a tertiary text or a secondary text on Aquinas. And as part of the core, I teach theology, Adam teaches history, and we're paired. And one of my pairs is biology, core biology. So the students that are in my core class are also in core biology. And we have these convocations where the biology profs will give a lecture and the theology profs will give a lecture, and then we'll do questions and answers afterwards. And it's always amazing to me that the only time the biologists and the theologians can have a conversation where we're sort of on the same plane conversationally is when we're speaking evidentially about the text or the authenticity of the text or the historical data, the reliability of the text and how we get there, the verifiability of the resurrection and that type of thing. And it's when we get outside of that into sort of more religious language, if you will. You can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes. That where the trouble begins with the scientist, because we seem to be making then claims that that don't make any sense, right, or that aren't verifiable at the very least. And so the evidential approach is, I think, what we'll spend the lion's share of our time on as we do our series, and there's a good reason for it. The reason for it is that I think it fleshes out to be the most helpful when you're in a world that's full of people that, whether they know it or not, have been greatly influenced by scientific naturalism. And when we do this in my class, I have them all take out their cell phones and say, you don't realize how much science influences your life every day until this thing in your pocket that really rules your life right now. It tells you how to get where you're going. It tells you the answer to every exam you take, whatever. When it stops working, everything goes to hell, and that's why. And so it's good. I think we'll spend most of our time on it. I don't want to do too much about it today because I want to save it for the shows, but I think it's helpful to know that as a perspective, this is where I come from when I do apologetics talks, based on what you taught me. I've heard Adam speak. I know it's where he comes from too, and it's just important to know this is sort of where we live, so that as we move forward.
As a little throw in there, at both a liberal Lutheran seminary and acclaimed conservative Lutheran seminary, none of the questions that you and I are talking about ever came up. Or if I did question the undergirding of what the prof was saying, there were only 2 of us in Columbus out of 70 who asked that kind of questions. Everybody else was from the soft sciences.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
2 out of 70.
And Adam taught apologetics at one of our seminaries for a while, which was a rare thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was the course in the books, but it wasn't always offered because there wasn't somebody to teach it.
Right.
Always.
Well, to have a dedicated prof to teach apologetics.
Yeah, it's hard to find.
Right.
There's, I've not confirmed this, but I do know from sort of anecdotal evidence that there is when courses in apologetics are offered, oftentimes the prof is there to kind of undo apologetics.
Oh, yes.
Lord.
Oh, yes. And sainted Kurt Marquardt, actually the course was something of great interest to him. It was science theology, which was one of his loves. But it wasn't exactly an intro to apologetics. One of my students was in there, though, and he reported back to me later. He said in the introductory lecture, what Professor Marquardt said to every one of us was, go buy everything Dr. Montgomery has ever written and read it.
I picked up, it was Dr. Marquardt's course description. That was the course that was given to me when I got to Fort Wayne. And I was surprised at how evidential the description was. I was pleasantly surprised.
Well, I bet you are the first person to do an evidential intro to apologetics at either seminary for almost a century. Maybe more.
Wow. That's weird.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
weird?
it really is.
Isn't that weird?
I mean, this gets
in a
back
time
to the
of total unbelief. Isn't that a little weird?
For a variety of reasons too. It's apologetics is historically, when the theological disciplines were really defined, it's a subcategory of systematic theology alongside ethics.
Yeah.
And I think it was Dr. Montgomery who said it's also part of, he didn't use the term missiology, but it's the intellectual side of evangelism.
Sure.
Right, absolutely. This whole conversation reminds me of Jim Nestigan, who we just had as a guest on the show, has recommended to me a long time ago this book by, I think his name is Richard Koenig. I could be wrong on the first name. Last name is Koenig, called A Creative Minority. And he points out, and it's valid for all of, I'd say, Protestant Christianity, but even more valid for Lutheranism, is that we act as though we're a cultural majority when we're really a minority.
Right.
And we sort of go into the world acting like everything that we're offering is so great, and it really is, that everyone will just jump on board if they hear it and see how right we are, rather than understanding that we're a great minority and getting to be more of a minority every day.
Sure.
And that this is really important task that we're talking about defending the basics of the Christian faith. I mean, down to the level of, was Christ really Lord? Did he really raise on the third day as proof of that or not?
Yeah.
And if he did, that means something. And if he didn't, that means something
1
too.
Corinthians 15 is an
Right.
extended argument. If this, then that. If not this, then not that. That's hard to get into students' minds, that this is an argument.
Yeah.
But it is.
Right. I mean, Paul explicitly lays it out in verse 17, right? That if Christ be not raised, we are the most miserable of all people. And we've been lying to ourselves and lying to others, and our faith is in vain.
Yep. And we're still in our sin.
And we're still in our sin, even worse. All right. One more, maybe before our little break time. Adam, can you run us through sort of the classical method, or sometimes philosophical?
Yeah, well, I think the book on this is R.C. Sproul's Classical Apologetics, and it's kind of an evidential approach, but it's a two-step approach. It starts with arguments for God's existence and the proponent of this approach says you've got to do that first, because to make a case for the deity of Christ doesn't make sense if you don't have that background information.
Yep. And it's typical of books like that they get to Christ about chapter 7.
I mean, the great modern day example of this would be William Lane Craig's approach.
Sure.
Show that there's good reason to believe that God exists, and then after you've done that
start talking about the existence.
After you've gone through 6 or 36 arguments for God's existence, then we'll show you that God has revealed himself in time and space in and through the personal work of Jesus.
Inefficient as all get out.
Yeah. Theoretically, or abstracted from a real context where apologetics actually takes place, where it's kind of on the street or around a table, it kind of makes sense. But when you're in the thick of it, you don't have that kind of time.
No,
somebody's life is on the line.
Yeah.
Right?
And nobody was better than the Lutherans at saying, let's start with the incarnate Christ, and we'll work backwards to the Father and forwards to the end.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the real meat of the thing there.
I mean, that's maybe one of the real things to keep in mind when you're doing apologetics, is that somebody's life is on the line here.
Yeah.
The quicker you get to the only hope, the only lifeline, which is Christ, the better.
Yeah. And if you're doing the content of the gospel, the depth of sin, the person of Christ, his work and his resurrection, vindicating it, and you don't get objections, just keep rolling.
That's right. Evangelize. I've sometimes said in class that it's like, the difference is between you're on a ship, somebody falls overboard and they're drowning. What you do first is you throw them the little life ring with a rope attached, right? You throw it to them and haul them in. You don't sit there with them and describe from the railing how great this life-saving device is,
right?
And how wonderful it would be if they could just believe in it. You then start throwing it to them.
Yep.
Yeah.
You give them the gospel. If an objection arises, I'd say even in evidentialism, you sort of are having more precise aim as you throw it, bouncing it right off their head if needed.
Sure. I think it's worth mentioning in our circles that there's resistance to this all over the place in our prose. The usual one that I've heard over the years, if somebody voiced it, was, so you're claiming that somebody can think their way into Christian faith? Mm-hmm. And the answer to that is no. And the answer is no. If the apologist gets somebody to the point where he says to his wife, honey, I think this stuff might even be true, his job's done.
Right.
That's as far as the apologist goes. When you talk about saving faith in Christ, then you're talking about the Holy Spirit and the work of the Word and Spirit through the Word and all that. But that's beyond the apologist. The apologist is just trying to get the guy to say to his wife, honey, I think this stuff might be true.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I heard it once put that what apologetics can do is get the unbeliever to begin doubting their unbelief.
Uh-huh.
Where they're starting to think, this might be true, I probably should read more on it, meaning read the text of the Bible.
Right.
And that's where is it the paraphraser of the Bible, the Living Bible, who said reading the Bible is like trying to wire a house with the main electricity on? And so if you're looking at let's say in historical or evidential apologetics, we start with the gospel records as good, reliable historical material on the life of Jesus. If you can get somebody to read that because it might be of historical value, they're not just reading it then as a piece of literature,
Right.
but it's God's word through which the Holy Spirit works.
Yeah, never underestimate the power of the Spirit, even when somebody is reading it with doubt in their mind and in their heart.
Yep. We had, years ago, 2007 or so, I went to what some people call Dearborn, Michigan. It's the highest concentration of Arabs in the United States. And a lot of those Arabs there are Christian Arabs, but there's a huge Muslim population there. And somebody invited me to the Henry Ford Memorial Library to give a talk on or to give a case for Christianity, and invited the Muslims, which was not exactly the most well, it was intimidating. Let's just put it that way.
One year at Strasbourg, I had 9 Muslim lawyers in class.
Well, I did this basic case, the basic approach to apologetics, historical apologetics that you taught me. And I just went through that outline.
Sure.
And 2 years later, one of the guys who attended, one of these Muslims, contacted me and said, I want you to know that I'm baptized.
Holy smokes.
And so we had this exchange, and he said, after your talk, this wasn't my argument, he goes, but I realized that I had objected to Christianity because I'd been told to object to it. I had objected to the Bible. I considered the Gospels to be corrupted because I had been taught that. But you made me think I should probably read these things for myself. And what he did is he started with the Gospel of John. He read through it, and he was kind of confused, so he went to the local church, the local LCMS church there, and asked the pastor to help him understand the Gospel of John. And at some point, he said to the pastor, I believe this, can I be baptized? Now, in his particular context, that meant a lot more than just,
smokes.
I'm a Christian now. It meant my life is in
It's on the
danger.
line. Yep.
And so name change, he moves out, he's somewhere else in the U.S. But it was just by saying, hey, there's a good reason Christians consider Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John reliable material in the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
And it was him reading the Bible with somebody helping him, to be sure, that led ultimately brought down those defenses or those barriers he had to hearing it clearly.
Yeah, that's great.
That's a really powerful place to take a moment and pause and get to our break.
Sure.
Welcome to our break. We're very excited to be in the topic of apologetics. You can tell because Adam is just eating up the microphone today.
Either that or it's this rock star. How much caffeine is in this thing?
Shush. Don't announce that. My wife will hear and I'll get in trouble.
Oh, she listens. Ooh. And then, for our break today, 1517 has quite a few apologetic books. You can go check that out at shop.1517legacy.com. But Dr. Francisco happens to be heading up a new book to be published this year called Resurrection Fact. And we talked about how the meat of the thing was to go back to Christ, how that's kind of where this is all going to hinge, where people's lives are at stake and kind of where the evidence lies. And so we thought starting with Christ and the resurrection would be a good idea. So, Adam, why don't you talk about your new book for a little bit here?
Well, it takes as its assumption that, as Paul puts it, as it's translated in the New American Standard Bible in Acts 17, verse 31, that the resurrection of Jesus is the proof of, as Dr. Rosenblatt might say, the whole enchilada.
Yeah.
the resurrection is historically up until the time of David Hume in the 18th century, and certainly thereafter, but that's when there were real challenges to it. Up to that point, the resurrection was the primary piece of evidence that that Jesus was who he said he was, his words are trustworthy, and so on. And so John Bombaro, a pastor down in San Diego, and I talked, maybe 2 years ago now, about putting together a book that spoke just to the issue of the resurrection, that would take the various challenges that are posed by scholars and more popular authors to the resurrection as a fact and address them in chapter after chapter. So we have over a half a dozen authors who are all specialists in their own particular field, looking at, for the most part, a particular skeptic and their argument against the empty tomb being accounted for by the resurrection of Jesus. So in that book, there's a chapter on there and in there entitled, "Can the Empty Tomb Be Explained by the Resurrection?" And it takes or goes after Bart Ehrman's little piece in his very popular Introduction to the New Testament, where he basically revives the old argument of David Hume that miracles are so improbable that they're impossible. Therefore, the accounts in the Gospels can't be trusted. Mark Pearson, who's a stellar defender of the reliability of the New Testament, has a superb chapter on why we can trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as good eyewitness testimony, or at least in the case of Mark and Luke, people who drew or wrote their accounts on the basis of eyewitness testimony.
Anything like Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses?
Very much. He draws from Baucham, N.T. Wright, the best of the best. John Bombaro takes on John Dominic Crossan, one of the founders of the Jesus Seminar, who claims that, the resurrection did happen, but it was a spiritual resurrection, not really a bodily resurrection. A young lady from Yale University writes a chapter addressing a contemporary scholar, Gerhard Ludemann, a German scholar, who says that the resurrection didn't happen, but he believes that the Gospels are relatively reliable, so we've got to account for all these appearances, and he says it was more like a mass delusion. And things of that nature are taken up chapter after chapter, and what I think we can say the book in total does is addresses every, with the exception of the real cockamamie ideas, every responsible or scholarly objection to the resurrection out there.
Terrific.
So
terrific.
hopefully it'll prove, I think it'll prove useful. The chapters are from very user-friendly. They're written from a more popular perspective to some chapters more scholarly. The footnotes are, I think, a gold mine. Every chapter, maybe with one exception, has a for further reading list if you want to look at that in detail. And just last week, John and I frantically put together an index, so it's easy to go back and find things after you've read it once.
Is it standard for 1517 that guys like me get a copy?
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah.
I'll steal one from Scott.
Thanks.
He keeps them in his garage.
I do.
I think. But we are supposed to on Monday get the final proofs, and so it should be published or printed, I think, within a month's time. So.
Good. Congratulations.
Yeah,
I'm glad it's done.
It'll be quite a work. It'll be quite a feather in Adam's cap and in 1517's, I think, to put out such a great apologetic work.
Terrific.
Hot off the press.
Yeah, so look out for a link in the show notes there. We're going to I think we're working online with the store to get a pre-order open ASAP, so we're going to try to get that available.
Let me verify again. The Resurrection Factor?
The Resurrection Fact.
Fact.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Josh McDowell wrote a book called The Resurrection Factor, so we couldn't. We weren't even considering that anyway.
That's great. All right, so on our methods, I think we have to touch on. I don't think either one of you will be happy to do it for us, but there's a method out there called presuppositionalism.
Ooh.
Yeah, and people who study apologetics will have run into it and might need to know that it's sort of out there and what it's all about. Can one of you handle that for us?
Well, its roots are back to a great, great man, professor at Westminster in Philadelphia for years, the late Cornelius Van Til. And he was a great, great man, greater than the system that he created. And basically it asks the non-Christian to assume the truth of everything in at least the New Testament, maybe even the whole Bible, and then look at his world through that lens and see if it doesn't cohere better than anything else he's got. So you're operating what philosophers call a coherence epistemology. That is this thing filled with self-contradictions or no? Now, a coherence epistemology has a whole bunch of weaknesses in itself. You can have coherent systems or almost coherent systems that are deeply bonkers. I mean, as much as the Marxist intellectuals worked on it for ever since the Bolshevik Revolution, they almost tuned that thing to where it was coherent.
Yeah.
But the classic example against is the existence of the flat earthers. They've almost done the same thing with their slide rules, now calculators, with the earth being flat like a plate instead of spherical like an orange. You say, surely not. I say, take a crack at it. It's almost coherent, and it's deeply bonkers. Mm-hmm. Until one gets to a correspondence epistemology, that is, do the propositions here match with the facts in the external world, you're really stuck. And think what you're asking of the non-Christian. The first move is, first assume that everything in the New Testament is true. Now that's a big step. That's the one that's at issue, whether any of it's true. So the Reformed epistemologist asks them to assume that it is, and then see if it coheres.
So basically, at the end of the day, what presuppositionalism is asking is that the non-believer accept all of the presuppositions of Christianity before coming into a conversation about why Christianity is valid or not. Yeah. It seems problematic at best. I mean, when you're
They're
dealing with
really
somebody,
good at the negative.
Yeah,
they are.
Right.
They're the best.
So it's kind of
doing the
case,
negative.
It's kind of alternate case destruction, right?
Yeah, and what the Achilles heel of the thing is, you never actually defend that the gospel is true.
You're simply just destroying all the alternatives.
Right.
Yeah.
And to do that, you'd have to know that there are 973 possible religious positions, and you're going to destroy 972 of them.
Right.
But in Southern California, everybody knows we don't know how many there are. It grows
They
daily.
grow every day.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's problematic in postmodernism because there's something to the fact that you have to defend why to think anything is true at all, let alone presuppose one particular thing is.
Right. Mm-hmm. And you've lost the scientist right there.
Right, yeah.
Well, yeah, because it's only internally coherent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or assumed to be.
If I wanted to be especially nasty, I'd point out the parallels with Barth's church dogmatics,
Right.
where the circle is a closed one.
Mm-hmm.
You should be nasty. You used to tell me a story about Francis Schaeffer. Mm-hmm. I think it was Francis Schaeffer, who Calvinist and presuppositionalist, but at the end of the day, he had to kind of give that up because it wasn't.
No, he still used it, but I remember when we were out on the lawn, lying down, just relaxing, I said, Dr. Schaeffer, can you tell me why you don't make more use of classical evidentialism? Mm-hmm. And he gave the best answer he possibly could have given. He said, Rod, it's because of the audience that comes here. Okay. All of the audience who come to L'Abri are from the fine arts or continental philosophy.
Okay.
So if they're shot through with existentialism, they don't believe in 10 minutes ago, let alone 2,000 years ago.
Okay.
And that's the best answer that he could have given. It's the audience that I come here.
So you were laying on the lawn at Liberty
Yeah.
with Dr. Schaefer.
Yeah.
And
Both
he-
our
and he
head-
just says,
heads on our
he's
elbows.
He's like, yeah, of course I would. Where else would I have been?
If Bill and Ted did build a time machine, I'd pay good money to go back and
I would
and
too.
videotape that conversation.
I would too.
Were you drinking beverages?
No, no. It was after church one Sunday, and he was still in his black suit. Yeah, but it was a time when I could get him one-on-one.
Awesome.
One thing with presuppositionalism, if they're you mentioned just a bit ago, is they are remarkable at pointing out the problems in other
Absolutely,
systems.
they're the best.
I mean, I think of the guy who died very young, but he was not John Frame, but
no, John's still living.
yeah, the Greg Bonson.
Yes,
Who-
he was Van Til's best.
Yeah, he could take an atheistic worldview and just deconstruct it, to use postmodern language,
Yeah.
and show not only that it was incoherent, but it had all sorts of assumptions within it
Right.
Yep.
that didn't work in
Right.
that materialistic
Nobody
worldview.
was
Right.
better at it than Bonson.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes useful. I mean,
Yeah.
that is sometimes useful for the apologist to at least have enough training and skill to recognize that there are presuppositions behind everyone's view here, and to point them out to somebody as they're.
We're going to have to do that with the coming generation because
I
they
believe
believe everything
I believe it.
has
Yeah.
to do with biases that we've
Right.
inherited or been taught, and it's
Right.
a black hole.
Right.
There,
Well,
you
yeah.
end up with no knowledge whatever about anything.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. Ask me about my core class this semester. 29, I think. 29 students, 3 Christians.
Well, and somehow though they believe that every scientific finding out there just has no presuppositions behind it, or like no expected results. I mean that's some of the joke with a lot of modern science is they do these experiments with expected results. And it's just
Man, if that kind of
Sets it
stuff
up.
gets into the engineering departments, we're screwed.
Okay, last one. We understand as we get into what we're saying is the last one that we haven't covered every option out there, or everything that's being used sort of in modern incarnations of old arguments or anything like that. But the last one we need to touch on, just because of our history a little bit, is sort of how the pietists might have
Yeah,
approached this.
we spawned it. And a lot of people who think that we didn't, especially in our church. But I think we did that all on our own through Spener and Arndt. Anyway, there's a whole anti-apologetic thought frame that says that even arguing is not spiritual. Even arguing. You say, but Paul argued one night so late that a boy fell off the ledge and died. It doesn't touch them. They have this inside track of knowing what spiritual is and what isn't spiritual. And so their counsel will be, pray for the one you're talking to. Okay, granted. Never indulge in any argument for the Christian faith. And there, people like me go, why not? But anyway, down deep, the position is that it's unspiritual to offer arguments for the truth of the gospel. Yeah. That's it at its core.
So your apologetics is basically light evangelism and prayer?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but never an argument to support.
right.
Is it connected to, or is it grounded in a fideistic epistemology?
Sure it is. Sure it is.
Why don't you flush that out for the listeners, Adam?
Well, there's... Oh, go ahead.
So fideism is basically faith in faith. If somebody asks you why do you believe, you say because I believe.
Yeah.
Or-
I believe for
Because
every
I
drop
feel
of
it.
rain that falls, a flower grows. I believe that even in the darkest night, a candle glows.
There's a recording of Dr. Rosenblatt singing that somewhere.
I used to have brides ask me to sing that at their wedding, and I didn't know any different. I was a boy soprano.
There's a famous hymn, Altair, I think. Altair. You ask me how I know he lives. I know
lives
He
in
lives
my
within my
heart.
heart.
Yeah,
within my
Ackley.
heart. Ackley, that's it. Yeah.
Yep. You ask me
That's
how
fideism.
I know he lives.
Yeah.
He lives within my heart.
Yeah.
To somebody like me, coming out of agnosticism, I would immediately attribute that to, stomach upset or
Pizza last night.
Yeah.
Caleb's pork belly that he made for us on Friday night.
Right,
Yeah.
right. There are all sorts of explanations that can be other than Christ within my heart.
Right.
I'd have 12 of them to suggest.
And furthermore, that's nice and that's happy and all that, but does he actually live?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if we looked at your heart, good heavens, what would we find?
Yeah.
I don't think we'd find Jesus.
Probably not.
The key thing here is it's inaccessible to the non-Christian
Yeah.
by definition. You can't get inside him and verify.
Yeah, and it's epistemologically, fideism is the epistemology of all the other world's religions.
Sure it is.
Yeah.
Hinduism, for example, there's an essay by a famous Hindu theologian or philosopher who says, point blank, you can't really argue for Hinduism. Hinduism is the eternal religion. It just is.
Yep. Yep.
You just know it.
Yep.
You feel it by your experience or your feelings or
Yep. It's direct knowledge somehow. And philosophers will tear that to shreds.
and rightly so.
Yeah, it deserves it.
What's the kind of stuff that gets, people out there saying religion's, psychiatric help for you so that you can just walk throughout the day.
Absolutely. It's a coping mechanism.
You don't rely on any truth within it, but as long as you feel Jesus in your heart, and that makes it so you're not depressed when you wake up tomorrow.
Yep. You don't blow your brains out.
Yeah.
The opiate of the masses.
But
Yeah.
here, the coinage is arguments, and the only possibilities are valid or invalid, sound or not sound. Has nothing to do with the content. That's why basic logic should be a force on every college freshman or sophomore somewhere. The basics of thought.
I've heard you say a year of physics should be mandatory for all pre-sem students.
Yeah, if I were in charge, and I never would be, but if I were, I'd say unless you've done a year of physics, don't even worry about applying, because it changes how we view knowing.
What do you think, Caleb? Could you get through physics?
I'm not super math heavy. I mean, I did one semester of, like physics chem at Concordia, one semester of biology. And I do well in the sciences. I like it. It's when it gets really math heavy.
Yeah, it wouldn't have to be. It wouldn't have to be math heavy. In fact, it might be good if it weren't. Not physics for the kitchen, but not that lightweight, but where it wouldn't have to be math destructive.
Yeah.
But where you go into the lab and your thesis either stands or falls with whatever happens in front of your eyes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Nature doesn't cooperate.
Yeah.
Well, I know Rosenblatt. I'm sure he'd allow substitutions. Chemistry, maybe.
Yeah.
Biology.
Well, down underneath chemistry is physics. They argue that within the faculties all the time. But yeah, something in the hard sciences. Not in the soft ones, not in the human ones.
All right. Well, I think that's our wrap up for today. Next time, we're going to touch a little bit on the do's and don'ts of apologetics, and then we promise we'll get into the meat after that. So thanks for listening to Thinking Fellows.
All right, guys. We'll catch you next time.